I'm Mike Schutt, the executive director of Worldview Academy. We do these conversations monthly, and I'm pleased that you guys have joined us. These are all archived on the Worldview Academy website under events, Worldview Conversations. You can look at any of our past conversations and just browse what we've done. I'm excited about the conversation that we're going to have today. Uh, as I mentioned, if you've got questions for Jeff as we go, please type those into the chat box, and we'll try to keep up with those. So my guest today is an old friend who I haven't seen in some time. He is the director of the Hale Institute at New St. Andrews College in Idaho. Jeff Shafer is his name. Jeff is the director of the Hale Institute, and he graduated with honors from Regent University School of Law 30 years ago this year. Jeff was a student of mine back in the day, a great student, and he's gone on to practice law in Cincinnati, focusing on criminal defense. But he's also done election law and constitutional work, and he moved on to work with the Alliance Defending Freedom as a senior counsel there, doing public interest cases and litigating religious freedom cases as well out of their DC and Scottsdale offices. So Jeff is a litigator, a lawyer, knows a lot about policy, constitutional law, and his move to the Hale Institute has allowed him to be free of the constraints, as he says, of the litigation context and focus more on policy, academics, and worldview questions. The Hale Institute is dedicated to the study and discussion of law in its substance, in its grounding, and how it affects persons and the community. And what we're going to talk about today is what Jeff has done as part of the mission of the Hale Institute, and that is he's written a piece called Machine Antihumanism and the Inversion of Family Law that has caused quite a stir around the internet and has caused some really great conversations. And so I'm just so happy that Jeff Shafer from the Hale Institute is joining us today. Jeff, thanks a million for being willing to take time to do this.
Sure thing, Mike. Thank you very much for having me on. I look forward to our discussion.
You bet. Yeah, I do too. So thanks. And I'm gonna kick it off just by maybe setting the table and asking Jeff to explain the thesis of an article that he presented. Again, talking about this question of law and policy that the Hale Institute does so well. And this paper was delivered at a conference, and it has sort of a unique contribution to the discussion because lots of folks, Jeff, have criticized the assisted reproductive technology industry and talked about the ethical implications and well, just because we can do it, should we do it? Lots of folks are criticizing from that perspective. So you're not the first to do that. But I think what you've done in this paper that you presented and the discussion that we're about to have is arguing that the law, by accommodating the assisted reproductive technology industry, is actually changing what law does. It is, you call it, inverting family law itself and placing in jeopardy what we value in the very purpose of the law. And so it's going a step further than just criticizing the ethics. It's saying there's something that the law is doing by accommodating these technologies that actually changes what law is and what law does and what law should be. And that's really a different discussion that moves it to the policy level and the worldview level on questions of law and policy. Do you mind sort of unpacking your thesis to start for us?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that as we exchange some words before going live. This is not an easy sort of thing to just kind of put out in a quick soundbite. It really does require a rather lengthy discussion. So I'm glad to have that opportunity. But I'll have to put on some number of minutes of background, probably even before I'm able to get to the question that you're registering about how this applies to the law. So yes, the essay focuses not just on the anthropological concerns of ARTs, that is, artificial reproductive technologies, which are grave. But my principal point is to showcase the the related legal significance and the corruption of the law itself upon granting permission for the commerce and technologies of artificial child production. As I mentioned in the essay, I have it here in front of me, the technocratic project of human reproduction now confounds historic American family law. And that's the point I'm wanting to register, although it's going to take some time to lay some background considerations. First of all, I would say the reproductive commerce and tech that I'm referring to, of course, includes the likes of the retail sale of donor sperm and egg, of surrogacy contracting, the eugenic endeavors of the IVF clinics. All of these, we might say, instantiate or enact the view of children as products or as projects for technical construction and purchase. And because all of these are going on basically unregulated, the field is called the Wild West, because it's essentially developed itself into this multi-billion-dollar enterprise without any interference from the law itself. Because all of these aspects of the ART baby-making enterprise are non-sexual, non-relational, commercial combinations of parts that are separated from persons, and often unrelated to the customers who are ordering the child. That is, this is a process that is entirely removed from and diametrically opposed to the procreative marital act. For this industry, the relationship of persons is absolutely immaterial. The genetic material from the mother and father of the child may have been catalog ordered. It may not have nothing to do with the customers themselves. The child may be surrogate gestated. Maybe it's gestated by the purchasing mother. The industry doesn't care which it is, as none of these has any relevance to the industry's operations, which is exclusively parts assembly for customers. So notice here that it is not just that the industry is incidentally facilitating this sort of fragmenting of persons, separating infants from their kin and the like. Rather, this is the meaning and essence of the industry itself, we might say, whose entire point is to make relationships irrelevant. So the defining feature and precept of ART baby making is that it is non-sexual, non-relational parts assembly technique. So while the customers may care a great deal about genetic connections to children, the industry operation could not care less. Its technological deeds, its business model are precisely to overcome the relational, the procreative, the nuptial act. As I wrote in the paper, in terms of this biotechnocratic and consumerist framework, the child comes into the world not naturally related to anyone, but only transactionally connected to the persons responsible for summoning him through purchase or technique. So there's the background. What of the law then, and its role with respect to all of this? I want to say that the law's hands-off posture with respect to the ART revolution is in fact an active participation in its upheavals. It is for the law to subordinate itself to the premises of this industry. How so? Well, by the law forbidding to engage with or regulate or get in the way of this industry, that is the industry is performing a redefinition of human nature. It's visiting these atrocities upon dignity. It's making small persons, experimentation devices. They're to be disposed of. It's all forms of commercial exchange. That is, human life is being treated in a way and to a level that I think would make the ancient pagan slave traders blush with shame. But the law, by allowing this to go on, essentially is conveying its approval of these kinds of humanity mangling. You know, the Roe versus Wade abortion regime, for instance, under which, abortion clinics can advertise and operate in broad daylight in metropolitan areas without any legal impediment. That's another instance of the law in its hands-off approach, essentially conveying dogmatically a point about the meaning of human life, of maternity, of family, of relationality. So just its removing itself ostensibly from the field is to convey an idea of what and who we are as persons. What is the nature of the family? How should children be coming into the world, and the like? So that's one aspect. Secondly, and this is a very important one, the ART field is not merely communicating ideas about personhood. It's creating infants. And because those infants are not being made or emerging from the procreative act of mother and father, in which the law would historically simply defer to the reality and the responsibilities associated with that relationship. But now these children are emerging as a result of the purchase of gametes, the hiring of surrogates and the like. Suddenly now we have questions of custody that are arising in an unprecedented way. What if the surrogate refuses to release the child to those who hired her? What if the same-sex partner of the woman who gave birth to the child, upon their splitting up, wants to have custody of the child, this child that person is unrelated to? Who gets custody? These are the sorts of questions that are now accumulating in substantial number in this field of tech reproduction. So what happens? The law gets enlisted to resolve those questions of contested custody. But in order to do so, the law must now come up with new standards of what parent means in this new tech model of family creation, this unnatural form of reproduction. Who is a parent now that relation, genetic relation, nuptial union are no longer part of how this child came into being? And the law, upon ruling on those questions, is taking the form of judicial decisions, which then turn into precedents. We've got legislative and regulatory standards that are being enacted. And all of these are necessarily having to resort to some consideration other than the natural and organic relation of maternity and paternity. And instead, what they're having to do is incorporate into the law the fragmentary and unnatural anthropology of this tech industry itself, thereby displacing all of the old natural family norms that govern the law and its decisions about custody in the past. So all this to say, the law's original regulatory neglect, we might say, its hands-off position with respect to the ART industry, involves it now later having to succumb to the very logic of that industry. And as a result, what we see is the removal of the natural family standards and its replacement with this new statist alternative. So my point would be, now in the law, the truth of children's familial identity is losing its place, its grounding, its justifying premises within the structures of understanding that are now ascending and governing within the law. Roughly stated, that's my thesis in this paper.
Okay, that's a lot. Thanks for doing that. And there's a sense in which what you're saying is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, there's an irony here that the hands off by the state has now turned into a totalizing state regime regarding what a family is, right? Because being hands off, you've allowed these technologies to define the human person. And so now the state, after the fact, comes in and says, this is what a parent is. This is to whom the child belongs. I think you say that's the central question here that has to be answered. To whom do children belong? And now the state gets to define that from the ground up, because these are things unconnected to what reality has shown us children and families and relationships to be. Is that right?
Yes, that's altogether correct. Well put, well summarized. You should have done the intro.
Not at all. No, go.
Well, I was just going to say that what we're seeing play out is with the introduction of this problem, with the law permitting this kind of creation of this industry to create children independent of their family status, is for the law ultimately to say, none of those relationships of mother and father to child, there's no significance in it any longer. So once the law permits this kind of process to take place, The old things that used to bind and govern the law are now absent from its mind. It must convert itself into an altogether different techno model that says essentially children don't come into the world with relationships that are already in place. They're not indelibly relational. They are isolated monads who are subjects of commercial transactions. And as a result, how do we decide who gets the child? Well, insofar as the law has permitted you to go buy eggs, to go buy sperm, to go hire a surrogate, obviously the law has determined none of those kind of organic natural relationships are meaningful because the law has permitted them all to be obliterated in the process of the child coming to be. So once that is the case, and the law has essentially put itself on record with that position, it now has to concoct an alternative determination. But what we know is there's no authority in the natural family any longer. Everything now is going to be orchestrated in terms of what the state determines. And essentially what it's doing right now is saying, who are the consumers who have made the purchase? Who has participated in the determination to fetch the child and bring it into life? And that means that there really is no such thing as a family that binds the state. There is instead only the contingencies of wish, choice, and power. And that is how family law is being inverted. It's being converted from something that before was a transcending and anterior reality that bound the state itself and is now becoming the product of the state, who determines who belongs to whom and so forth. And of course, that ends up leading to a series of other problems, which we might explore.
Well, and maybe this is the thanks for that. That's also helpful. The maybe one of the other maybe it's collateral damage or collateral problem that it creates that you've mentioned is this removes even the possibility as we become fully, this is all transactional. It removes well, let's start with this. You say that children don't come into the world as orphans, really, in this regime. It's worse than that. And that in and of itself takes away our ability to have compassion for the tragedy of orphans, to have compassion on the widow and the orphan, for example, as the Bible instructs. And so two questions. Why do you say it's worse than that? And why do you say the damage is on our ability then to express the kind of compassion for orphans, or the sort of you mentioned adoption as well, to say that adoption is mitigating a great loss. And we're unable even to have that approach anymore. So can you say a few? I know that's about 6 questions, but I think that's a good place to go next if you do.
Sure. Perhaps, I'm sorry, I keep looking down. I'm referring to my essay that we're talking about here. But one of the ways that we kind of take for granted a number of things about family is because it's so intuitive to us. We simply know that there is this intractable, indelible connection between parent and child. It's so primordial, it's basic to human nature that we, as I say, just intuitively have this kind of sorrow and mourning when we see a child who is separated, loses a mother and father, becomes an orphan. And indeed, we might say, our legal structures through time have all acknowledged this as well, not only assigning principal and default authority to the mother and father of the child. We automatically see them all kind of contained together within the authoritative natural family. But when that is broken, when it is lost, the law engages in a rescuing way. So it creates institutions like adoption so that the child can see a replacement circumstance to the extent that that's can approximate what has been lost. But all of these take for granted that we understand something about the natural family as being the default, as being the norm, as being the beauty and part of human existence itself. What I'm trying to say is this ART industry abolishes all those preconditions to our sorrow in those circumstances, because what it teaches us is that the children who come into existence on its model, and impliedly on any model, have no significant relationships. Everything that they come to enjoy is the contingency of choice later. And so this is why I say there is no such thing as an orphan on this model, because to be an orphan is to recognize that you had something and you lost it. But the ART industry would not acknowledge that there is any real relationality, which is why they can transact in this way. So what I say at the end of my paper ultimately is children are, it's not just that they're orphans. That's a word that acknowledges the truth of their relational identity. This is saying there is no such thing as relation, so we must do away with the very idea of orphan. Likewise, where we would want to say adoption is rescuing a child, it's a gracious act because it's restoring something that was lost. Again, we on the ART model and the law's new approach to all of this can no longer say that the child has lost anything. So we are thereby forbidden to express sorrow, forbidden conceptually to know that adoption is a rescue, because the predicates for that position have been taken away from us on this model. Did that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So there is a question in the chat that maybe is a next step to go in asking this very line of reasoning and what it does to law, right? This does it contribute in other areas to a totalizing statism, right? When if we can invert family law this way, is there an assumption then that relationships in other areas and the commenter here, I think it's Anne, if I'm reading correctly, says this doesn't this it, this is contributing to when government schools usurp parents' authority, for example, and this question of parent-child relationship leaks not just out of this particular area, but it can leak into other areas of the law because it's about how we see the role and grounding of law itself.
That's right. Yes. I was just kind of flipping through my notes here to find the portion where I said this, but I'll try and paraphrase. The the point that I aim to register is on this new model, because there is no natural, organic, anterior truth of human nature that relates to the family itself, but we're just individual parts to be distributed as consumers and state actors might permit. Um, the authority that has traditionally resided in the family, with mother and father being understood as being the appropriate custodians and caretakers and directors of the upbringing of their children, that now disappears as a legal model. I mean, if the state wants to acknowledge that, sure, it can do it, but it's only going to be an arbitrary decision, not one that conforms to the truth of the matter. So the question of what has traditionally been called parental rights is now in dire straits, I think. And we see this perhaps most manifestly, as your questioner brought up, in the context of transgenderism. So if there is no reality to male and female, which is the thesis of the trans ideology, then there's no reality to mother and father either. If there's no legally cognizable significance to being male, being female, which is perhaps in its most pristine form demonstrated in maternity and paternity, if those aren't real or legally cognizable statuses, then of course the authority that in the past has been associated with it also evaporates. So there's something helpful, we might say, in watching this trans business play out, where we see that once we adopt this new way of looking at family and at person and so forth, out the window goes all of what we used to prize, what used to be central to our legal understanding, like the authority that parents have.
Wow. Okay. So the law makes truth claims and has to stand on truth, and the law has to have a grounding in sex, family, reality. So when that's lost, it matters. Uh, this is far-reaching and troubling, and I know that. Well, okay. Before I want to go to, I want to ask at some point the question. Okay, where are there footholds for those who believe that the law has to be grounded in truth? How do we recover? How do we push back? How do we act? But before I get there, you talked about just the fragmenting and the individual parts to be distributed and delivered. And your example in your essay was of the global baby, right? That there's can you talk about how that is illustrative of this thing that you're talking about, that one, it's a pure consumer product here, and the law by hands off now is in charge of these things in a way that it never has been before. I think it's a maybe a good way to kind of reiterate the significance of what's happening here.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe I'll just kind of give a bit of attention to that portion of my essay for those who haven't looked at it, and then riff on it a bit. But what I'm
Yep.
registering there is that this global baby, so called, is representative of the entire industry. Um, by that I mean this. So you may have, as I write here, the so-called sperm donor may live in Israel, the ovum contributor may live in Mississippi, the gestator in New Delhi, none speaking the same language, and the only one to lay eyes on the child is the customer in Denver who placed the order and flew in to pick it up. So classifying all aspects of reproduction in merely functional, consumerist terms enables their commercialization, thereby qualifying for offshoring and otherwise participating in the, I'm being ironic here, the efficiencies and larger genetic and physiological resources of global markets. Liquid nitrogen freezers, air transportation, and information technology make geographic divides of no production consequence. So what's clear is this: a child now on this new model is the composite of contributors, and their contributions, be them gestating, gamete donation, are utterly meaningless. They're just parts in this consumer project of making a child. And as a result of this, again, we see the law, by authorizing it and then participating later in it with its custody determinations, is saying exactly what the industry says, which is that the human being is meaningless in its relational dimension. There is no such thing as a natural family with its own authority. A child doesn't come into the world already relationally associated and thus secure in a family line, in a genealogy, in a place where he fits. The child is lost. The only way he's connected is going to be through transactions, commercial transactions that the state itself then ratifies. So you see, we are in this kind of dimension that's unknown to the history of the world, which is why I find it so alarming. This isn't one of those things that's popped up and been resolved through time, but the application of the techno imperative back upon ourselves, where we are the project of our own making, is doing disastrous work, not just to the cultural mind, but to the law itself and how it participates very profoundly in the organization of the society.
Wow. Yeah, man, that's why this is such a devastating a topic, and I think why the folks that heard you present this paper said this is this is something that we don't think deeply enough and see, because right, the your examples of both abortion and transgender seem to be so limited that we don't see the far-reaching consequences. Here it's right there as you've just laid it out. And speaking of sort of the collateral damage and in your examples early, Amy has a great comment here. And she says, as a Bible teacher, think about the way that Scripture uses the imagery of the family of God, God as Father, children, we're brothers and sisters in Christ. Even that now we're now in danger of speaking to a world that doesn't understand these concepts. Talk about when the law fails to see the truth, to see reality, and that law trickles into culture. We've lost these fundamental ideas, even of the way that God communicates about himself to us, and his ministers minister the word to us. That, talk about a disastrous consequence.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the very categories necessary for us to apprehend the faith are, at the same time that all of this that we've been talking about is transpiring, those categories are being eliminated at the same time. I mean, this really is a diabolical development. And this is why I'm so alarmed that the law itself is participating in it. because it really is doing in all of the things we must understand in order to understand our place in the cosmos, our relationship to God who made us, our destiny, the precepts of the faith, the very faith, by the way, that created the civilization that we inhabit. So we're turning a corner here that's doing damage in every imaginable area of human endeavor and thought and the like. So this is no small thing. It's profound, primal, basic stuff that we're now messing with.
It really is. Yeah. Okay, so maybe we shift just for a minute and talk about, all right, we're the church. Uh, we are we are reformers. We are those who stand against the diabolical schemes of the enemy, and we push back against the cultural inroads in the as the as the church. So, what can we do, particularly as laymen, right? Not there's not. I mean, there are those who are called to pound on the courthouse door and to do all that, and that's important. That's a great calling. What do we? Where are we in terms of how to address these things in the law? Do you think? What are some not action? No, I'm not asking for action points. All right, let's do this, this, and this. But where culturally can we be involved here?
You know, obviously the point that I'm trying to register is one where I want to convey the idea of what this process means. What does it mean that we as a society have embraced this kind of techno making of children? What does it mean for the law to have kind of taken these precepts into itself? And but I don't want to say that we have altogether internalized and made totally authoritative that new model. So this bears some explanation. I would instead want to propose that we're in something of a position of unsustainable tension between our historical model, the human model, that which recognizes the reality of the family as created by God, and this diabolical replacement suggestion. And the new one, I'm criticizing particularly so as to energize or invigorate a resistance. So that, I mean, I suspect we're not going to do much about it unless we understand what it is. And that's what I'm trying to convey. What is this thing? So in a sense, this conversation and my writing and speaking on these sorts of things is precisely to get folks, for lights to turn on, people to see that this is a 4-alarm fire, not a kind of a side issue. And so we really ought to be pursuing an aggressive pushback. But as I say, there's this tension that exists in the law, and it's going to have to resolve itself one way or the other. We cannot both have this new model and the one that we have taken for granted through millennia. So we continue to have precedents and standards in our law that acknowledge the reality and significance and legally binding authority of the family relationships. So, for instance, if you were to look at, this was a case back in the 70s where the Supreme Court is resolving a question about a foster care relationship. And the court, in the process of saying there's no due process right to a foster parent to a child, made the point that that state-created relationship of foster care is separable from the natural family. And the court went, I don't have the case in front of me, but basically said the creation of the family, its existence and authority and truthfulness is independent of state action. It precedes, it antedates, it actually governs the state. There's something of a kind of a human right associated with that, whereas the foster care arrangement is a different sort of thing. And as a result, you don't have the same kinds of claims and so forth as against state pushback. So even, what was that, 40 years ago, we have the courts still talking in terms of the difference between the natural and authoritative and the state created. What I'm suggesting is the new model eliminates the first and adopts entirely the second. But when the court was speaking that way in the 70s, it is, of course, giving voice to our legal tradition, to a great deal of constitutional case law, to the common law standards, to the statutory standards that are distributed across the country. So we have the long lasting deposit of family law still with us. It's running into, but we're seeing this tension with the new model. And I only bring this up to say we have a whole lot of stuff to be working with. The history, the long understanding that the law has taken in the Anglo-American world, in our own constitutional structures in the states across the Union. So in a sense, we have a great deal of material to be using to push back. And now, of course, I want to also point out is there is this slow trickle of developments on the other side that is itself accumulating. I could point out, for instance, the revised Uniform Parentage Act, which has been enacted now, I think, in 8 states. And the point of which essentially is to eliminate the categories of male and female, mother and father, because these are discriminatory terms that get in the way of same-sex couples having children or thruples or what have you. So you see there's this contest going on between the two, but I want to say, not only because we have the truth on our side, but also because we have a mountain of legal precedent, that we really are in a good position to be pushing back against these developments.
That's amazing. How many did you say? How many states have adopted the revised Uniform Parentage Act?
8. I think Massachusetts most recently. And in the process of doing so, this was in December of last year. In the process of doing this, the legislature went through and basically scoured its entire statute book, all of them, and found every place where he or she, mother, father, husband, wife, and eliminated all those words to replace them with generic androgynous terms so that the family structure is understood as an expression of individual choice, not a natural reality.
That's amazing. That's alarming, but amazing. And but your point is well taken about the long history and rich traditions that we have available to us in this tension. And I appreciate you saying it's not a done. It's not game over.
Right.
There's just a lot of stuff developing. Got a great question in the chat that will allow you, I think, to clarify the point you're making about law. And the question is, I, uh, understanding the law creating a vacuum that it then has to solve. But the end of the question is, this questioner says, I'm not certain I understand how this is fundamentally different from a child given up for or taken away for adoption at birth. In both scenarios, there's no material connection to the natural parents or genetic code, etc. So
Yeah.
you're not saying adoption is bad. So how is this so different?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm glad whoever it was raised it. I appreciate the
That's
opportunity.
William. Yeah.
William, thank you. That's a great question. The the point with adoption, as I was alluding to earlier, is we have um, we have that opportunity. The law has created the what would we say the rescue device so that the child who lost mother and father can now find him or herself in a new home in which we have, to the extent we can do it as close as possible, restore what was lost. But in order for that to even be an aspiration, for the law to be interested in doing it in the first place, is for the law to recognize that that child lost something, one, and then secondly, that what we want to give the child as the replacement is to approximate the norm as close as possible. So in this circumstance of adoption, yes, it's true that the child ultimately ends up in an adoptive family, but it's doing so in terms of both a recognition of loss and an intent to give that child as much as or as close as possible what was lost. And so the norm, even in the exceptional case, is being honored. So we might say in the adoption context, adoption is the exception that honors the norm. Whereas in the ART model, the whole point is to obliterate the idea of a norm. And so we no longer have any interest in or even capacity to honor that old standard.
Well, and I appreciate that your point is not take a position one way or another on that. Your point is to say, now that we're here, the law has made it the worst possible, has made the worst possible tactical decisions about this, and that and the question of the ethics of involvement in it now, that comes before, and that still has to be argued and addressed. Great, thanks, William. So just along those lines, right? The questions of, given the technologies we have, right? There are families making decisions that say, okay, we know well. There are ways to interact with ART that can also mitigate the damages too. So what about on the post side? Now that we're here in this tension, are there ways that we can talk to our children? Are there ways that we can speak in our churches about the human person and about the role of law that help get us, that help articulate in ways that help resolve this tension in favor of the ancient and traditional way that the law does its work, rather than in the bureau technocratic sense?
I, one of the questions that were registered earlier was making the observation that there's a kind of significance to the family that has theological dimensions to it, that even our understanding of the faith is put in jeopardy when we lose the meaning, the symbolic significance, the authority of the relationality within the family itself. And so the question with respect to its relation to the church and discussions in that context, I think would probably really need to be giving attention to precisely that issue. There's something about the symbolic nature of the husband-wife relationship that is cosmic. It's pure and important, and in a sense helps us understand better the relationship of Christ and the church. And as a result of that, when we have the kind of obliteration of that relationship in the enactments of the biotech industry, which makes reproduction something that's done by third-party technicians in a lab, we have done great violence and damage to the meaningfulness of the relationships. This child is no longer the emergence of love. The child is the emergence of financial transactions and scientists who are engaging in conduct that has absolutely nothing to do with the relationship of the persons who have employed those persons to do it. So we are making children the products of our wish. We're enlisting technical, scientific others to basically replace the meaningfulness of the marital family. And that's not just doing damage to the child. And of course, we haven't talked about all the great damage that actually is done in the physical nature to the child, but also the knowing that your origins were as a result of the exchange of dollars, not because of the loving relationship between your mother and father, is to do quite some damage to our understanding of what the family is and the role that it plays in the cosmic order, in God's creational design. And there's a lot more that can be said about all of this, but I think it's something, particularly as you mentioned in the church conversations, that ought to get some traction and perhaps improvement. I haven't seen a whole lot of discussion along these lines in many of the contexts I've interacted with. These kinds of questions, I think, are revealing, and the points that you register likewise reveal the tension that exists. We have a kind of series of commitments and premises that have been behind and undergirding a lot of our legal standards that are now being placed in doubt. But your point, I think, is a good one, and it is illustrative of the struggle that's now taking place in the law. Because the law is not just a series of serially presented arbitrary standards. The law itself really is something of an organic whole, and it has an incentive, kind of a magnetic pull toward bringing all of its parts together in something of a coherent unity. So there's a discomfort in the law when, there's this, well, if this is true, then this can't be, or if this is, and vice versa. And so we're always in the law arguing in terms of how do we make this development correspond with this new authority? And this is the tension that I think is ultimately going to have to be resolved. I mean, another example of this is, why do we have a problem with black markets and infants? I mean, if you're allowed to like get parts together and hire a surrogate and make babies and so on, why do we continue to hold to the prohibition on actually selling children in once they're born? This, by the way, is going on a great deal in foreign surrogacy markets, where the buyers never show up to pick the child up after the child is born. Or maybe there's twins born instead of the one that was ordered. What do you do with the extra? And this is where the black market takes place. But there's a sense of inconsistency between our kind of strong opposition to the sale of infants and our participation in what is, in essence, human trafficking in the first place.
That's good. That's good. Thank you, Janice, for that. We got one question in the chat from Gary that says, are there recommendations from a Christian perspective with regard to the law that would help Christians take advantage of what's happening in ART already, or is that too fraught? Right? Can we say, let's make it possible to adopt embryos, for example, that will otherwise be destroyed? Or are those things that are there options in the law that would help Christians within this industry, help them take advantage of doing the sorts of goods that they can do in this, right? Are there benefits? Are there ways that the law could be used for Christians within ART, I guess, is part of the question.
Yeah, you had suggested at the beginning of your question that the whole thing might be too fraught to take advantage of on its own terms. And that's the position that I take. I don't think this is one of those things that can be ameliorated or mitigated in its effect by accounting for its own premises. The whole thing has to be shut down. And the law, by not forbidding this kind of transaction in human parts, is just kind of facilitating it. And it's changing its whole way of conceiving of what the person is and what the family is. And we cannot work within that system. The only thing we can do is get rid of it. And so I don't think there's any appropriate engagement with it on its terms, because it is so fundamentally compromised and diabolical that to participate in it is to facilitate its continuance, which is exactly what we do not want to do. We need a restoration of the old natural family order. And the law is in a perilous state until we return to that standard. ART doesn't fix anything. It bypasses the whole thing altogether. There are fertility treatments that are actually treating the problem, but the ART industry is not treating the problem. It's just doing away with it as a relevant feature in the first place. And so, I mean, maybe I'm repeating myself too much here, but what I want to say is, there is a real assault taking place on the family, its meaningfulness, the marital relationship, and so forth, when we convert the act proper to marital love and put it in the laboratory. And we treat children not as the providential emergence of that love, but rather as products that individuals decide to arrange as commercial transactions. You have just obliterated the meaning of so many things in the process of doing so, that it's not fitting for Christian families to be pursuing that. And I do not say this without sympathy for infertility. I really understand there's great suffering there. And so I don't want to be misunderstood. But what I'm saying is, there's a great deal at stake. All problems can't be resolved simply because of a sincere wish that they be. There are important things that are in play, humanly vital things that are in play, that we do not want to overthrow in the process of our interests. Now, and this is not to point a finger at anyone either. One of the things I regularly do in my classes when I'm talking to students about bioethical questions, I am by no means wanting to indict individual persons who have utterly pure motives for what they do. I'm talking about the significance of the acts that are being engaged in. And I fear that we're in a time where no one is thinking along those lines, which is why I'm not really upset with any individuals. It's more, I'm just trying to convey the idea of here's what's at stake. Almost no one is doing this. And so please understand, I don't want to be appearing as cold hearted. I want to be identifying what I think are vital issues that we can't lose sight of.
I appreciate that, and I know that's not your main thrust, and so I appreciate you wading into, and thank you, Gary and William, for asking the question that leads us into these more controversial areas. I think that's great, and what I hate to do is say, wow, now that we're on the edge of something we could fight about a little bit, it's 12:30 Central. I do want to respect Jeff's time and all of yours, even though now we've got a really great conversation going, and I think Jeff's final point is one worth making, and that is to be aware of these things and to know and to understand what the law ought to be, what it is, means that the law needs to recognize what a human person is, what a family is, what a man and a woman is, and these are things that we need to be aware of and how they work. So Jeff, thank you. This was really thought provoking. It was a great conversation. Thanks for joining us for this.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike.
Thank you all for joining us. Jeff, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys on the second Thursday next month for our next Worldview Conversation. Thanks, everybody.